Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 26th of June. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. Apologies for us starting a couple of minutes late this evening. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 488 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The Russian Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu has appeared on state television, and emergency countermeasure terrorisms have been cancelled in Moscow and surrounding regions as the Kremlin seeks to restore calm following Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed mutiny. Footage released by the Russian Defence Ministry today showed Sergei Shoigu riding in a vehicle and arriving at a command post, taking reports from officers and studying a battlefield map. The video was released without sound, and it was unclear when and where it was filmed. However, the footage was intended to show government support for Shoigu. The Wagner chief has not been seen or heard from since he left Rostov with his troops on Saturday evening, with an apparent deal offering him amnesty and exile in Belarus. However, Russian state-owned media is reporting that a criminal investigation into his actions has not ended. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said today that the aborted mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group demonstrates that Moscow committed a strategic mistake by waging war on Ukraine. The EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, has said that events over the weekend show that Russia's military power is cracking, and that the monster Putin has created is turning against him. However, he warned that the instability in Russia is dangerous for Europe and must be taken into account in the coming days and weeks. The Lithuanian president, Gitanas Nausėda, has warned that NATO will need to strengthen its eastern flank if Prigozhin is exiled to Belarus. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said that the weekend's events have exposed the weakness of Putin's regime. He said that he had discussed the turmoil in Russia in a phone call with President Biden. In early morning trading today, the Russian ruble opened at a near 15-month low against the dollar following the Wagner mutiny. Suspilny, the Ukrainian state broadcaster, has reported that Russia attacked Ukraine overnight from the south with 3 Caliber cruise missiles and 8 Shahed drones, and that 2 missiles and 7 drones were shot down. They also reported that Ukraine shot down 4 drones of an unknown type which were launched from the north. And the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that the Australian government has pledged a new $110 million military assistance package in the next round of support for Ukraine, and that will include vehicles, ammunition, and humanitarian funding. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and a former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen served as a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011, and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament, representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 until 2021, when she was lucky enough to retire. Maureen has also been a teacher and a counsellor, amongst many other roles in her career. Maureen, it's a while since you and I last spoke. How are you this evening?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
Very well indeed. All the better for seeing you. It's great to see you this evening, Maureen. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. Our first item this evening, it has. Our first item this evening is that people in the UK die sooner from cancer and heart disease than people in many other rich countries, partly because of the NHS's lack of beds, staff and scanners, a study has found. The UK underperforms significantly on tackling its biggest killer diseases, in part because the NHS has been weakened by years of underinvestment, according to the report from the King's Fund Health think tank. It performs poorly as judged by the number of avoidable deaths resulting from disease and injury, and also by fatalities that could have been prevented had patients received better or quicker treatment. The comparative study of 19 well-off nations concluded that the UK achieves only below-average health outcomes because it spends a below-average amount for every person on healthcare. The sobering findings come 10 days before celebrations across the 4 UK nations to mark the 75th anniversary of the NHS's creation on the 5th of July 1948 by the post-war Labour government. The King's Fund pinpoints the NHS's lack of doctors and nurses as one of the main reasons the service is struggling, as judged by many of the criteria used in the think tank's analysis. On Thursday, the UK government will finally publish its long-awaited workforce plan to tackle staff shortages in England, which Rishi Sunak said yesterday would be one of the most significant announcements in the history of the NHS. The 118-page report compares the resources available to the NHS in the UK and its performance with those of the health systems in countries including France, Germany, Sweden, Japan, Singapore, and the US. Among its main conclusions are that in the UK, life expectancy is second worst among the 19 countries studied. People who have a heart attack or stroke are more likely to die as a result than in almost every other country studied, including within 30 days of admission to hospital. Survival rates for many of the most commonly occurring cancers, including breast, colon, cervix, rectum, lung, and stomach, are below average. Access to NHS dental care is worryingly threadbare in some areas, and there are fewer CT and MRI scanners than in any of the other countries studied, and the number of hospital beds is the second smallest, owing to historical underinvestment in capital spending. The NHS trails behind its international cousins in some key markers of a good healthcare system. We are not by any means where we should be, said Siva Anandachiva, the author of the report and the King's Fund's chief analyst. Although Scottish NHS has more doctors and nurses per head of population and outperforms the rest of the UK on waiting times, the Scottish Government's options for further investment in the NHS in Scotland are limited by having a budget fixed by Westminster and paid under the Barnett formula. So, Maureen, we're told by this report that health services in the UK are crying out for investment and improvement with better long-term planning and political support in order to prevent more people dying early from diseases, according to the King's Fund. So, apparently, lack of political support for the health service kills people, according to the King's Fund. Why is it that the London mainstream media isn't talking about this at all?
Yes, I haven't heard about it on any of the mainstream media, which I think highlights again their collusion with the Westminster government. It would be great to see a breakdown of the analysis on a devolved basis to see if Scotland is managing to outperform the rest of the UK, because the Scottish government has put a lot of effort into programs like Detect Cancer Early, prostate cancer. Testing was introduced in Scotland long before it was introduced in England. We have an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest strategy, which has saved many lives because more people know how to do CPR. So it would be interesting to know, as I say, what if there was a breakdown by devolved governments. But as you said, we have a lower average spend on the NHS than in the countries in the comparative countries in this study, and a lack of nurses and doctors. And that all, as you say, Andrew, leads to is a result of the underfunding of health by a government hell-bent on continuing on austerity, which we know doesn't work, and that trickle-down, having been tested for many decades now by Tory governments, doesn't work. So we need a completely new strategy, and I think the concentration and importance of placing a light on the well-being economy, which is being taken forward, here in Scotland is really important, but very but distressing for people who have found themselves in that situation where they haven't been able to get a doctor's appointment. And okay, every country has suffered from COVID. We haven't been able to get a doctor's appointment or scans in time, and cancers, for example, have reached stage 3 and 4 before it is confirmed that that's what this situation is. So, yeah, it's not a good read today.
Thanks, Maureen. That's a great summary of the situation that the King's Fund are telling us about. Let's move on now, however, because the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has made a statement to the House of Commons on his proposed mortgage charter. Mr Hunt said that lenders responsible for 85% of lending have signed the charter, which is being published today. The key measures were announced on Friday after his meeting with bank bosses. The charter says that there will be no repossessions within 12 months of the first missed payment, and customers having trouble paying their mortgages will be able to switch to an interest-only mortgage for 6 months, or to extend their mortgage term so they can reduce their monthly payments. Commenting, the SNP's economy spokesperson Stuart Hosey MP said, "Although some of the Chancellor's statement is welcome, warm words will not ease the pressure on Scottish households. The UK government must review whether setting the inflation target alone remains the most appropriate target for the Bank of England to be working towards, and consider adding to the tools of the central bank to both control inflation and generate growth." However, he continued, regardless of the Chancellor's answers to these crucial questions, there can be no doubt that only the SNP is offering voters a real alternative through independence. So, Maureen, firstly, one point of detail here. Where is the plan for renters, who the Chancellor didn't even mention in his statement today, and many of whom are now paying higher rents because their landlords are simply passing on the increased mortgage costs? I wonder, is this a very Tory approach? I mean, they sell all the council houses, don't build any more, expand the rented or rentier sector, and then exclude tenants from any sort of protection.
Yes, I mean, I think that is a real problem, because we have people making property letting their sole income now, and how they manage to get mortgage after mortgage from the banks really is beyond me. I would have thought that really there could be some legislation brought in to make sure that you should pay off one property before you buy another, kind of thing. But that's something for the longer term. I think I've said on this program before that this problem is not the same in other countries. I think I've mentioned that my daughter and her partner managed to get a 25-year mortgage at the rate of 1.86% fixed for the 25 years in France. So the way we're doing housing in Scotland and mortgaging in Scotland is not the norm, as the Westminster government would like you to have you believe in other countries. The banks shouldn't have to be told to by the Westminster government to give interest-only mortgages, change to that, or mortgage holidays, or extend the term in this crisis situation for many. And it's really important to get the message across that don't miss a payment. Contact your bank or building society before you know you're going to miss a payment, rather than wait till you have missed several, because it's you have a better chance of getting not sympathy but help from your lender if you contact them early. And that's something I'd really like to get across. But the bigger picture is this idea that everything's left to the Bank of England to control inflation through interest rates. There are other tools. That's a monetary tool, but there are other fiscal tools that could be used by the government to get the inflation rate down more quickly. And I think there's a ploy here to put all the onus on the Bank of England and say it's nae your fault, pal. before the up-and-coming election.
That's a good point, Maureen. With this current government, it's always somebody else's fault, never theirs. So the point you make, I think, is very valid. We'll move on, however, this evening, because following comments by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, that the UK government is preparing to block public sector pay rises, that Rishi Sunak has confirmed that he is considering ignoring the independent pay review body's recommendations, under which teachers, police officers, prison officers, and junior doctors could be offered pay rises of 6% or more. The Prime Minister said that he is determined to take responsible decisions on public sector pay, even if that disappointed staff. The comments have prompted outrage among trade unions, which said that such a move would have profound consequences for the future of industrial relations. The SNP's Deputy Westminster leader, Barry Black MP, called for the UK government to accept the independent recommendations at minimum, warning that public sector workers must not be punished yet again because the UK government wrecked the UK economy. Commenting, Barry Black MP said, "Public sector workers are paying an unacceptable price for Westminster failure, showing why Scotland needs independence. After 13 years of Tory austerity, it beggars belief that Rishi Sunak is considering imposing even more cuts to the wages of nurses, teachers, police officers and others. Public sector workers must not be punished yet again because the Tories wrecked the UK economy with Brexit and shambolic mismanagement." So, Maureen, Mr Sunak has expressed concern that what he calls unaffordable public sector pay hikes could trigger a wage price spiral. He told the Times Chief Executive Summit on Thursday that wage settlements need to be fair, but they need to be affordable and responsible too. What does he mean?
Well, he doesn't say that wage rises in the private sector among the bankers and the financial sector need to be curbed, does he? He just talks about public sector workers. And in our first item in the programme tonight, we've been talking about the King's Fund report, where it said that there were one of the reasons for the early deaths, was lack of staff. Now, they like to use conventional economics when it suits them, but if there's a shortage of labour in your sector, then you increase the wages to attract people into the sector. But that's obviously not going to happen. So in the health service, in education, are they just hoping that the private sector will come in and take up the slack? That does seem to be happening, because there seems to be, I don't know where you are, Andrew, but here there seem to be lots of private clinics popping up in streets that I drive around in Aberdeen. And I think there is definitely a move for a creeping privatisation of services. Now, that is not going to happen. I don't think the public in any way, shape or form are going to allow that to happen. We've seen in some areas where people can't get dentists. But you do get the impression more starkly every day that this is the Tories' view of and ideal for the future in GB. And as you say, we need to get out of that as soon as possible and have a socially just society where people can access education and health as they need it, and how it's based on ability to learn, not ability to pay, in the education service, and NHS treatment at the point of need, as Hamza very much stressed at the weekend, is what we want to see in Scotland, and is indeed the way of things in other countries.
Absolutely, Maureen. And we will come back to the privatisation of healthcare in a couple of items' time this evening, so we can talk about it a little bit more when there's time. But we'll move on again just now, because the UK's post-Brexit border strategy risks further pushing up food prices, according to representatives of the Fresh Produce Consortium, the FPC. Traders in the food supply chain are warning that they will not be able to absorb the extra cost of charges levied for import checks on goods entering the country from the EU and the rest of the world, which are due to be introduced in the new year. Estimated additional annual costs of more than £10 million stemming from these import charges would have to be passed on to consumers, fueling food inflation just as prices are thought to have peaked. The FPC, which is an industry body that claims to speak for 70% of the UK's fresh produce supply chain, that includes businesses that produce, package, move and sell fresh fruit, vegetables, cut flowers and plants, has written to the UK government ministers to share its members' concerns about the UK's post-Brexit border strategy. In a highly critical submission to the government, the FPC accused Westminster ministers of adopting an outdated and highly efficient border solution which fails to meet the needs of a modern, progressive industry and simply adds cost for consumers. The trade body, which has about 650 members, said the current border proposals would add cost, delays and disruption to imports of fresh produce and could lead to gaps on retailer shelves similar to those seen earlier this year. Among the proposals made in the draft strategy issued by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, and the Cabinet Office is the introduction of a charge of up to £43 for each consignment after January 2023. The FPC estimates that lorries can carry on average 10 consignments, while 1.2 million consignments of fresh produce enter the UK each year. As a result, it estimates that the fresh produce industry could face up to £11 million in extra costs each year. The UK sources fresh produce from about 100 countries, but the majority of imports enter the country from the EU, even if they have not been produced outside the EU. So, Maureen, firstly, is this an indication that Downing Street is still wedded to the most extreme, most damaging Brexit possible? Or in political terms, is this a kite being flown at this stage to gauge public reaction, and that's amongst a public who the polls are suggesting have now turned against the Brexit catastrophe?
So my understanding, and if my memory is correct, is that this was part of the Brexit agreement. And remember, it was all rushed. Boris Johnson, get Brexit done, regardless of whether they negotiated a good deal for the UK or not. It was get Brexit done at all costs. But this particular implementation of the rules was delayed because they knew it would be extra costs. So while we are seeing the dreadful, the awful cost of Brexit, we have not yet seen the full cost of Brexit. And this, I think, will further damage, if they still had any hope of getting back into government, damage the Tories at the next election. But we have not seen, which I would expect from a Labour party that hopes to get into government, some, promise that this would be looked at. So even within the Conservative Party, we're seeing some folks saying, oh, we need to, rekindle relations with the EU and try to mitigate some of the effects of Brexit. But, it is an absolute disaster. And more people, even the hard Brexiteers, are quite quiet at the moment, aren't they? But the only way back for Scotland is independence and rejoining the EU as an independent country. And that, in my view, can't come soon enough. To me, rejoining the EU is as important as getting independence. And, I was pro-independence before we joined the EU in the first place. So, but now it's just so absolutely crucial to our future well-being as a country.
Thanks, Maureen. That's some great insight there. I appreciate it. Now, concerns have been raised about the high proportion of refugees seeking to join family members in the UK, but who have had their applications rejected by the government, despite using a safe and legal route. as suggested by the Home Secretary. Data obtained via a Freedom of Information request by the charity Refugee and Migrant Forum of Essex and London, RAMFL, showed that between 2019 and 2022, from a total of 2,206 refugee family reunion applications rejected by the Home Office, 1,386, that's two-thirds, were later overturned on appeal. Just 34% of Home Office decisions to reject family reunion visas, 720, were actually upheld by judges. Nick Beals, the head of campaigning at RAMFL, said, Suella Braverman and her colleagues insist people should use safe routes to come to the UK, yet in practice such routes barely exist. That the vast majority of these refusals are overturned on appeal year on year raises serious concerns about the quality of Home Office decision-making. People applying to join family here are often extremely vulnerable children, living in an unsafe environment and at risk of trafficking, exploitation, or kidnapping, made worse by a lengthy appeal process. One of the few safe routes the government makes available is refugee family reunion, which allows close family members such as a spouse and children under 18 to reunite with an adult who has been granted refugee status in the UK. UK government data shows that the applications for refugee family reunion have reduced by 40% since 2019. Home Office refusal of a genuine refugee family reunion applications can, of course, be a matter of life and death when people are stranded in conflict zones. So, Maureen, one of the few theoretically safe routes that the government makes available is refugee family reunion, which allows family members like a spouse or children under 18 to reunite with an adult who has been granted refugee status in the UK. But the number of applications for refugee family reunion has reduced by 40% since 2019. So between 2019 and 2022, that was only 2,106 applications, just over 2,000 souls. That barely sounds like a route at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And, word on these things travels fast throughout countries where people are living in fear. And that in itself, hearing that, will push up the number of people who want to come by illegal routes. But it just highlights again, and we've talked about this loads of times, that not only is the system of dealing with people who come in the boats broken completely, but also the system, which is supposed to be a legal route, is broken. And if applications are taking so long to be processed, you wonder what the Home Office staff at the front line dealing with this are actually doing. I mean, are they totally overwhelmed that they just have no supervisors to be able to say, well, just one step at a time kind of thing? Or is it a diktat from Suella Braverman saying, "Oh, don't you really have to bother about it because they think that this is good politically for them? The bogeyman, the bogey refugees will stir their own hardliners." I can't see any evidence of that, and I think people are not convinced by that argument anymore. They've seen how badly, as we talked about in the previous item, about how badly the Tories have handled Brexit, and they're seeing that they're incapable of handling this. Even going back to an earlier item about the economy, they're failing on so many counts. It's just absolutely desperate that we get rid of them as soon as possible.
Thanks, Maureen. Now then, let's move on because a report by Oxfam has said that private hospitals in India and Kenya have benefited from UK government investment funds, despite those hospitals being accused of refusing people on low incomes vital health care or holding them hostage until the bills have been paid. Oxfam's Sick Development Report is a critique of the millions of pounds taken from the UK aid budget and invested into foreign businesses and programmes in poor countries via British International Investment, which is owned and managed by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. The report found that the UK government was one of several, including those of France and Germany, and international groups like the World Bank, that backed investments by wholly or part state-owned agencies into private healthcare groups, themselves often owned by large US private equity groups. Oxfam said that investments by these agencies, known as Development Finance Institutions, DFIs, into private healthcare providers in low and middle income countries should be redirected into strengthening public health systems to help those living in poverty to access healthcare. It said many of the countries receiving development money for healthcare had become go-to destinations for health tourists. Much of the report focuses on the activities of BII, which is the UK's development finance institution. It has a mission to invest in private sector organisations in developing countries to boost growth and to achieve the United Nations development goals. The agency said all its activities are directed towards achieving these goals and supporting private healthcare businesses to strengthen the quality and accessibility of healthcare in a way that improves the lives of millions. Oxfam said that evidence from its research in India, Kenya, and Nigeria was that private hospitals failed to honour promises to accept accident and emergency cases, and that the profit motive meant that cases of financial or medical abuse were covered up. The charity's senior health policy advisor, Anna Marriott, who investigated many of the claims made against individual hospitals, said more than 90% of BII's health investments were out of sight and unaccountable, made via fee charging and profit hungry private equity funds, mostly domiciled in tax havens. An inquiry by the All Party International Development Committee into the UK's use of DFIs is due to be published next month. So, Maureen, firstly, going back to a discussion we had a moment ago, is this simply another example, if any more were needed, that privatising healthcare provision is a very, very, very bad idea wherever in the world you do it?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because clearly, places like India and Kenya haven't got a developed national health service like ourselves are fortunate to have that basis. And many hospitals, in the past have been run on charitable status. But clearly, international finance is seeing that this is a way of making money and manage, I would say, to dupe governments into giving them money and not being held to perhaps the rules of the finance that they might have had. So, for example, taking people in regard to accident and emergency and not letting them go until they've paid. I mean, that is awful. So I think the blame here should lie with these private equity companies, particularly from the US, wanting to get a fast buck at the expense of people in poorer countries. But also, shame on the UK government for not having stricter rules regarding this, and making sure that the money goes to the right kind of hospital. So an example of this would be the Scottish government has given money to a hospital that I know and have visited in the south of Malawi called Mount Melange Hospital, which I think is pretty much financed on a charitable basis. It may get some money from the Malawi government. So it is possible to channel money, but then again, the Scottish government has, because of the developments of partnerships with these countries and partnerships through charities and NGOs, we can keep a tight grip and oversight on how money is being spent. So there are different ways of doing it compared to what the UK government has been exposed as doing in the particular uh, results of this the Oxfam report. So it's bad news if this is going to continue to be the way that things are done with our foreign aid money. And already money from foreign aid has been diverted to, was it helping with refugees or something? I can't remember. So
Yep.
it's the money for what we would call real overseas aid is already diluted, and this looks like another way of it being diluted. So, poor people in real need in countries that we support are obviously not getting the money. Well, we're not getting the money to them as we would expect it to.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. And that's a good point with regard to the hospital that you previously visited in Malawi. We'll move on now because greenhouse gas emissions from the energy industry continued to rise to new highs last year, despite record growth in wind and solar power. That's according to a comprehensive review of global energy data. The report by the Energy Institute found that fossil fuels continued to make up 82% of the world's total energy consumption in 2022, in line with the year before, causing greenhouse gas emissions to climb by 0.8% as the world used more energy overall. Global energy consumption is expected to rise further in the year ahead, potentially bringing higher greenhouse gas emissions, after China ended its strict COVID restrictions on travel this year that had previously kept a lid on jet fuel consumption. Juliet Davenport, the Energy Institute's president, said despite further strong growth in wind and solar in the power sector, overall global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions increased again. We are still heading in the opposite direction to that required by the Paris Agreement. The report, which is published in partnership with KPMG and the consultancy Kearney, found that renewable energy sources, excluding hydropower, met only 7.5% of the world's energy demand last year. This represents an increase of nearly 1% over the previous year, driven by record growth in wind and solar energy. Solar generation climbed by 25% in 2022, while wind power output grew by 13.5%, compared with the year before. However, the report also found that the renewable energy boom has been eclipsed by a rise in global energy consumption of 1.1% last year, and that resulted in more oil and coal being burned to meet demand. Global oil demand rose by 2.9 million barrels a day last year to reach an average of 97.3 million barrels every day. So, Maureen, firstly, does this report and the news that total consumption is continuing to increase, does this point to the root problem and a possible solution, which is that collectively on this planet we simply need to consume less?
Well, I definitely think we need to consume less, absolutely. The consumer society should be consigned to the dustbin, really. And, um, I thought post COVID that perhaps that was the route we're going to take. But when you think that China, commands so much of the market for so many goods, and it is coming out of COVID. You can see how the global emissions are going to continue to rise, but that is no excuse for us not to continue to really um, try in every single country to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, I don't know whether this report says anything about the kind of, oil and gas companies are sometimes accused of greenwashing and not really looking to reduce the emissions from their output of oil and gas. So this doesn't look good for the oil and gas industries worldwide. And it means that countries and rich countries need to redouble their efforts in trying to have, well, one, to reduce consumption overall, and two, which of course, people who think that economic growth is the god of economics, and reduce our reliance on oil and gas, and must be given a higher priorities for all Western consumerist societies.
Thanks, Maureen. And in the middle of this, the demand for coal climbed to highs not seen since 2014, driven by demand, as you say, in India and China, and also the appetite for coal increased in line with record high gas prices in Europe and Asia following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, thinking for a moment about the events of the past 48 hours, if we're, as a planet, are going to get a proper handle on this threat to the planet, should those of us who care about the future of the planet maybe assemble a few thousand troops and some tanks and set off for Moscow to have a word?
Oh, no, no. um, um, I suppose, Moscow isn't looking at its greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. It's got other things to think about, hasn't it? And that's the case for a number of countries throughout the world, whether it be wars or um, famines or whatever. It's maybe not on the top of the agenda, but then it is becoming more important when we see wildfires raging in countries that have never had wildfires before. I haven't heard recently about how Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, is getting on with reducing the coal output from Australia, which was really high under their Conservative government. But yeah, it's, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not easy, and many countries have reached the point where they've done all the low hanging fruit stuff and really need to be, you know, driving into other areas and upping the number of electric cars, for example, like Norway has. So there's still, we think we've done a lot, and we have, and Scotland is leading the way in many areas in this, but there is still a hell of a lot more to be done.
Thanks, Maureen. Now, we've got one more story this evening, one more item this evening, which relates to the climate crisis, and that's that new research has found that greenhouse gas emissions from shipping could be halved by 2030 without damaging trade, as ahead of a countries meeting to discuss a potential new tax on carbon produced by ships. Emissions from maritime transportation amount to about 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but there are few commercially available alternatives to the cheap, heavy, and dirty diesel oil used by ships. The shipping sector has been slow to take up emissions cutting technologies, and an increasing number of countries are now calling for a tax on shipping to encourage ship owners to invest in emissions reduction technology. The International Maritime Organization, which is the UN division that governs global shipping, has been meeting in London today at the start of a fortnight of talks on decarbonising and the potential for a new levy of up to $100 a tonne of carbon produced by ships. A shipping levy was discussed by nearly 40 world leaders and the heads of global financial institutions last week in Paris at the summit for a new global financing pact hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron. World Bank estimates show that a carbon tax on shipping could raise as much as $50 to $60 billion a year. Eamon Ryan, the Environment Minister of Ireland, who acts as the EU's lead negotiator on loss and damage, said that the IMO discussions were finely balanced. It's 50-50. It's not certain that it will be agreed, he said. He urged all countries at the 175-member IMO to take the first steps towards the tax. We need to show real commitment on addressing the climate crisis, and these mechanisms would give the developing world confidence that it's no longer just time for talking, it's time to act. As the IMO meetings taking place in London until the 7th of July begin, research published today by the consultancy CE Delft found that CO2 from shipping could be cut by between a third and a half this decade by using already available techniques. Using oil-powered ships more efficiently, Developing new propulsion technologies such as hydrogen, solar battery power, and modern forms of sails or wind assist technologies could reduce emissions by between 36 and 47% within the next decade, compared with 2008 levels. So, Maureen, campaigners said it was important that the research published today has found that cutting emissions will not have an impact on global trade, as previously countries including Argentina, China, India, Brazil, Ecuador, and Saudi Arabia had cited damage to trade as a reason for opposing attempts to regulate carbon within the IMO. So do you think, will those countries, in light of the reporting now, will those countries now begin to change tack?
Well, I think this report is really important if they're saying that it's possible to not damage trade by cutting emissions. Surely you would think that all these countries would be prepared to sign up for that. And if there is going to be levies on carbon emitting ships, which I think there should be, um, and there's some that could raise something like $50 to $60 billion a year worldwide, and that was reinvested in countries and retrofitting houses and things. Um, then I think that that is really substantial. I mean, the shipping industry has had the ability to reduce its carbon emissions for years because you can retrofit what's called scrubbers um, on the ships to reduce carbon emissions, and I don't think that's been done to the extent it has. It could have been done, and there's absolutely no reason why new ships should not be fully um, hydrogen or other sources that are not oil users or gas users. So there is the technology out there. All Norway's ferries, for example, run on green technology. So it can be done and it should be done. And the shipping industry needs to take its responsibility as well as others.
Thanks, Maureen. And of course, the opportunities for re-engineering and retrofitting new technologies to the existing shipping maritime fleet ought to provide employment and other opportunities in parts of the world where shipbuilding and ship maintenance and ship repair has a long history. For example, on the Clyde in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, the two ferries that are being built at Ferguson's were to be dual fueled. I'm not sure whether the battery operation side of it has been shelved for the moment, although the equipment is in the on the ship. I've seen it on the Halito one, but on the Glensanix. But it was it was probably put in the wrong place, and the pipe fitting to the engine wasn't put in when I saw it. So
Yes, yes,
anyway, we better not go down that route. But yeah, it is possible here in Scotland
it is.
as elsewhere.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. Now then, finally, Craig Brown, the former Scotland manager who led the Scottish national team to Euro 96 and the 1998 World Cup, has died at the age of 82. A statement from his family said Craig died peacefully today after a short illness in University Hospital Ayr, surrounded by close family members. The family wished to express their deep appreciation of the outstanding care and attention provided by hospital staff and the countless messages of support and sympathy from friends and colleagues. At this particularly sad time, the family now requests that their privacy is respected during the grieving process. Before taking over as the men's national team manager, Craig Brown was in charge of Scotland's youth teams and led the under-16 side to a World Championship final in 1989 and the under-21s to the Euro semi-finals in 92. Craig Brown was assistant to Andy Roxburgh when the senior team reached the 1990 World Cup and Euro 1992 finals, and he took over the role of manager from Roxburgh in December 93. He was in charge of the Scotland team for 70 games and remains the men's national team's longest-serving manager. The First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, called him a towering figure of the Scottish game. The First Minister said, "Craig Brown and the Scotland team he managed gave us many good memories over the years. You would be hard-pressed to find a man who loved Scotland as passionately as he did. My thoughts with his family and friends at this sad time." So, Maureen, briefly, the Scottish FA president, Mike Mulroney, wrote that Mr Brown was meticulous in his coaching preparation and passionate in his support of Scottish football. The greatest tribute that can be paid to his capabilities is the respect in which he was held by his peers, who also happened to be our all-time great coaches, among them Jock Stein, Sir Alex Ferguson, Walter Smith, Jim McLean and Andy Roxburgh. Craig deserves his place in the pantheon of great coaches. So is it fair to say that Craig Brown sits comfortably in the company of others like Jock Stein, Alex Ferguson and Andy Roxburgh as the managers of the national team?
Absolutely. I definitely think he's up there with the Jock Steins of this world. And the reason that I think was a great manager and coach was that you rarely, if ever, saw him lose his temper. And even when he was commentating, I don't think he was losing his temper. He was quiet but firm, and I think players and those around them, the whole team, respect that very much, rather than being shouted at and having hair dryers thrown at them. So yeah, it's a sad loss, and we seem to be over the past few days been losing a lot of people of that generation. But I'm sure he will take a high place in the history of Scottish football.
Thank you, Maureen. That's a very, very good point, and he certainly does sit happily and comfortably in the pantheon of the greatest managers that the Scotland football team has been lucky to have. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to continue to develop the station, making new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Now, we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. On this day in 1695, it saw the establishment by an act of the Scots Parliament of the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, which is better known as the Darien Scheme. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like, of course, to give very special thanks to our very special guest for this evening, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it, and I hope to see you soon.
And you too, Maureen, thank you. I'm away to dream about emigrating to the Isthmus of Panama. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.